On this episode of Turning Point Tactics, we're talking about the Approved Ops card pack and the CritOp mission in particular. This is the competitive way to play Kill Team 40k in the new edition. We're going to go through what the missions are, how you score the points on them, and a bit of analysis of how potentially you can better plan your games out to make sure you score more points more often. So stick around. Hello and welcome to Turning Point Tactics, the competitive Kill Team 40k podcast and YouTube channel focused on giving you the strategies and tactics to seize initiative every turning point. I'm your host Ryan and I'm here to give you the tips and tricks to elevate every part of your Kill Team experience. If you enjoy this content and you want more, you can join our Patreon for as little as £3 a month. We'll get access to our Discord, Patreon priority questions, early access to videos including Kill Team bat reps, faction guides and much more. If that's not for you, you can support just by hitting like, subscribe and sharing these videos amongst the community of Kill Team enthusiasts local to you. With all that said, let's get into it. Alrighty, so as I said, we're talking about the Approved Ops game system for the new edition of Kill Team, and this is a competitive way to play Kill Team in the latest edition. There's three main methods of scoring in the new edition when it comes to competitive play. CritOp, which is the primary mission that we talked about, or we are going to talk about now, which is 9 different primary missions with a maximum that you can score on each of 6 VP during each game. So both of you will be playing the same CritOp during the game, and you can score 6 VP on that. You also have the CillOp. That's a score-based system on how much of your opponent's models you kill or incapacitate during the course of the game. To max that points, you'll have to table your opponent. Tabling your opponent is like a board gaming way of explaining that you've removed all of your opponent's models from the board. You've incapacitated all of their team. You've killed everyone. That's not necessarily that common, but will potentially be something that people now push harder to achieve than they did previously to try and maximise that score. But that is also out of 6 VP. Finally, you have TAC-Ops. TAC-Ops like a secondary mission. They have a slightly harder caveat in how you can achieve them and score them. So slightly more complicated, but they're also worth a total of 6 VP. So interestingly, there's 3 separate routes that you can go to score points in this edition of Kill Team, and they're all weighted exactly the same. However, Games Workshop introduced a thing called the primary op, and this is their way of having an asymmetric win path. So it's a really interesting way of sort of biasing the game to your particular play style and how you want to play. So for any of those 3 methods I talked about, so the CritOp, i.e. the primary mission, the CillOp, or the TAC-Op, you can select one of those to be your primary op, and you can essentially gain half of the points you score on it, rounding up again further. So that's a maximum of 3 points if you scored 5 or 6, 2 points if you score 3 or 4, or 1 point if you just score 1 or 2 points. This makes some really interesting break points for the game, and particularly for competitive. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about in a lot of my guides is understanding where those VP breakpoints are, and really focusing on that as a way for you to be able to understand what you need to do to better deny your opponent VP versus necessarily scoring your own, because potentially denying your opponent a single VP, i.e. stopping them from going from 2 VP to 3 VP, could have a big impact on their primary up as well and deny them more points down the line. So it's a really interesting sort of way to think about the game going forwards. So we're going to look at a bit of that analysis as well. So it is an asymmetric win path route there, and to understand really what your best option is to score, you need to understand how likely you are to be able to achieve those maximum 3 points in that asymmetric route that you want to choose. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. But so the main points that I want to focus on just as an introduction before we get too much into the weeds of it, because we will go over each mission in hopefully a little bit of detail. I'll explain how the mission works itself, the actions, all that sort of stuff, and the scoring. But I just want to focus on some of the overview points that is probably common across all of them. So firstly, the primary mission now always requires action points, i.e. APL. So you have to spend actions to score points generically. Now, how many action points you need to spend is going to differ mission by mission. For some missions, you potentially could just spend 1 or 2 action points in the entirety of the game and maximize your score. There's ways that potentially your opponents could spend action points that benefit you if they're not careful, and therefore you could use their APL to your advantage as well. But there's other missions where you're going to have to spend action points every single turning point to be able to score those points, and that's really important to understand. So in the kill team sort of competitive community, we talk about APL efficiency, action point limits efficiency, and this is making sure that you use your action points in the most efficient way possible to maximize your scoring and maximize your damage on your opponents. So that's two main sort of things that you want to think about when you're using these action points, because action points affect everything in the game. It's your movement, it's your killing potential, it's your scoring potential, it could affect your tac ops and all that sort of stuff. So when you're doing your analysis of teams, you need to look at how many action points you have available to yourself and really have a think if you want to go for an action point based secondary, noting that your primary might now require significantly more action points than it did previously. It might also require less. So there's some interesting bits there for you to think about as we get into these videos. Now, when I've been doing the analysis of these CritOps, I've been focusing on some sort of key points, and this is the way that I have been thinking about it as a way to understand in my head where I think I should be putting weight of my effort and potentially what I should be choosing for my primary op. So firstly, one of the points that I think is really important is the total VP that's available. Now, that sounds a bit weird, right? Because you're probably thinking to yourself, well, you told me earlier it was 6. Yes, there is a maximum of 6 VP that you can score as an individual for your tac op, but there's also a max theoretical VP that's available on the board. So for instance, if we take the game such as loot, each player can loot each point once per turning point, and each player can put a maximum of 2 points, but there's only 3 points on the board. So with 3 turning points of scoring, the maximum VP that's available on the table is 9 VP. So that's really important to understand as a player, because you know that if you want to try and achieve 6 VP, if this is what you're trying to go for, or 5 VP as your primary sort of op, and that's the break point that you want to get really is that 5 VP or better, well, you need to make sure that you're taking, a significant portion of the available points. However, if there's more VP on the board available, and therefore both of you could potentially score 5 points, well, that's a lot less of a risk when it comes to you playing against a non-cooperative opponent who is trying to deny you points. All right, so if they can score 5 points and you can score 5 points, well, you're more likely to be able to achieve that as a primary op. So that's one thing to be able to first think about, is how much VP or total VP is available. Next is when, first was timing, so when that VP is actually scored. So you've got total VP and then timing. So for me, this is understanding between, is it scored during the turning point, i.e. as you're playing the game, and therefore is there a race to get points? Is it scored differently as the turning point is moved continues during the turning point, or potentially is it scored right at the very end? Is it scored more towards the start of the game or more towards the end of the point? Is there potential that you're going to score no VP until the last turning point, and therefore actually when you're thinking about your action efficiency, you need to be able to bias yourself toward the end, and therefore you need to be able to try and make sure that you're around and surviving until the end of the game, right? So, that's something to think about, is the timing, and that then plays into your tempo. So once you've understood what the timing is and the total VP, you can then start thinking about how you want to play the pace of the game. So as I said, if for whatever reason all the VP is scored at the very end of the game, well, you probably don't want to be rushing off straight away turning point 1 and trying to do loads and loads of damage, because potentially you won't have any models left if you overexpose yourself. Or maybe that is your game plan, because you know that your opponent is a very fragile team. So if you can do the damage early on, you can then buy yourself the capacity to be able to pick up those objectives later. So this is kind of like the difficult part for me, because it's going to be very, very difficult for me to tell you exactly what the right thing to do is, right? So I can't say to you in every circumstance, you should in this mission you need to play a fast tempo, you need to be out and doing this, because that might not be what's correct based on what your opponent is doing. So there's a little bit which is, I'm going to give you some stuff to think about, and these are the tools and methods that you should be applying when you're thinking about the problem, but I can't tell you what the right answer is necessarily. I need you to do the analysis yourself. But what I can do is give you a handrail and some ideas and some prompts that might then make you make better decisions and hopefully come to a good decision and a good game plan yourself. So that's kind of where I want to start with this. So we're going to get into the missions now and go through 1 through 9 and sort of explain how the mission works, the overview, and then talk about those main points. So I want to talk about the total VP that we have available. I want to talk about the timing, the tempo, and then whether or not I think it's probably a good thing for you based on the primary op, based on the VP split that we have from those total VPs. So hopefully this is useful, and we'll start talking about mission 1. Alrighty, so let's talk about mission 1, Secure. This mission is going to be pretty familiar to those of you who have played the last edition of Kill Team, because it is taken straight from the last edition of Kill Team, but there is a few little tweaks which we'll go through now. So firstly, the mission action itself. So 1 AP mission action is just secure. 1 objective marker that active operative controls is secured by your kill team until that enemy kill team secures that objective marker. So that basically means if you go within 1 inch of your control range of an objective marker and your APL is higher than your opponent's APL that's within 1 inch of that objective marker, you can spend a mission action and you can then flip that objective to your control. And that's going to stay under your control and you're going to score points for it until your opponent flips it back. But there is some restrictions on the mission action itself. So an operative cannot perform this action during the first turning point. So you can't rush off straight away, turning point 1, and grab them all, and then let your opponent have to try and take them back. You have to wait until turning point 2 onwards. And you can't perform this action within control range of an enemy operative. So if you charge an enemy to get onto the objective, you're going to have to kill that enemy first or make that enemy run away from you before you can then score that point, or spend the AP to make it over to yours. And that is a change from the last edition. So those of you who played the last edition, all of these mission actions, just for awareness, have that caveat where you can't do it whilst in engagement range of an enemy operative. Some teams have a special rule or a special ability that they can use to be able to get around that, but most teams can't. So something to be aware of, if you want to try and stop someone from being able to do that mission action, you might just be best charging into combat with them and denying them the point from being able to do it at all, or being able to do the action, particularly if they're limited on APL. But let's talk about some victory points and how they score. So at the end of each turning point after the first, so again, you can't do this in the first turning point, calm down, you have to do it from turning point 2, 3 and 4. But at the end of each turning point after the first, if any objective markers are secured by your kill team, you score 1 VP. That's any number, right? So that's 1, 2 or 3, you're going to score 1 VP if you have an objective marker controlled by your kill team. And then the second point, or the second way you can score, is if you have more objective markers secured by your kill team than your opponent's kill team, you're going to score another VP. So there's ways to get 2 VP per turning point, so you can only ever achieve 2 VP going forwards, but that's really important to know. What it does mean is that your opponent can be scoring 1 VP and you can be scoring 2 VP, but there's no way for you both to be scoring more than 2 VP at turning point, or for you both to be scoring 2 VP at turning point. So therefore, the maximum VP that's available on the board is 9 VP. So this makes it really interesting because this isn't necessarily like a rush-based game. So you know that the split between you, the maximum you can get, if you get 6 VP, your opponent's only be able to get 3 VP, but you can actually deny your opponents more points by controlling their objective and taking that away from them during the latter turning point. So you can also deny them VP if you want to. But the bit that I would say about this is timing and tempo. So each of these objectives, these 2 conditions that's going to score you VP, they are scored at the end of the turning point. Okay, so therefore, whatever you do during the turning point doesn't really matter. You could both be spending APL, flipping this from yours to theirs, yours to theirs, yours to theirs, yours to theirs. Doesn't matter. Whoever has it at the end is who's going to score. So the way that I sort of view secure is it's a bit of a slower tempo game because of the fact that it's scored at the end of the turning point. You don't necessarily need to rush out straight away, but what you do want to do is ensure that you have control of it at the end by having spent the APL. Now, there is a caveat to this, and I'll say this for quite a lot of these things. Nothing's ever quite as simple as just a simple rule of just wait to the end of the turning point and go score it, because of the way that the control works. So you have to control an objective to be able to then take it back into your hands. So what your opponent might do is start putting models on the objective to contest it with APL. Now, they could do that by either putting a model on there so that the only way you can reach the objective is by getting into melee, and therefore you might not have enough APL to be able to fight them. Or they might put a particularly tough model on there with 3 APL, say, to be able to deny you being able to put a 3 APL model on and take it back. But equally, if you're a 2 APL team playing against a 2 APL team, then they could potentially throw a model on there that's 2 APL, and then you have to kill that model before you can take that objective back because you'll be putting a 2 APL model on there. There's a few workarounds though you can get with that. You can comms buff or APL buff your model to suddenly become 3 APL, and then you can move on and be able to take it away. So the way that I like to play this in like a tempo sort of based approach is, if you can wait until the end of the turning point, then you should. But if you can't wait, then you should go forward and do it, and you should take it where you can. And when it comes to sort of priorities, I want to be looking at where my opponents can reach my objectives with higher APL than I can put on that objective, and make sure I protect it. So if I know that they have a ability to potentially temporarily buff someone to 3 APL, and they're going to move and dash and take my objective, well, I might want to just wait and have my model that with buff APL, let them do that first, and then I can move dash onto the objective, use my 3rd APL and take it back. And now they've wasted their extra APL, and I'm in a better place because I've got the VP at the end of the turning point. So that's kind of like the key bit to understand. The main point is, though, what I'm saying is that you need to look at what your opponent's doing and where they can move, and you don't necessarily need to rush, right? If you just move on to objective straight away, the likelihood is they can an APL buffer model move on and take it away from you. There are some defensive plays that you might want to think about with this one. So, for instance, putting an icon bearer or something like that on there to make sure you have the APL resiliency to make sure they can't take that away from you. But generically, you don't necessarily need to rush. So during turning point 1, I'd say you don't actually want to be playing too aggressively. Additionally, there's very little benefit from taking all the objectives in turning point 1. So you really want to be stacking your models to be able to reach 2 objectives, because that's the important bit. So if you're going to try and max on this, you really want to be trying to look for that. So what I'd say is turning point 1, you want to probably move some models up so that you have some models on your home objective if you want to, so that you don't waste APL having to move onto the objective and then tap it. You could potentially move and have a comms guy buff someone, or hand out some sort of additional APL to someone else, or do something with that model, or shoot, or whatever you want to do. But you don't necessarily want to be moving if you can avoid it. And ideally, you want that model to then be able to move off and do other things. So actually putting like an aggressive mobile model on there, or a shooting model, kind of makes sense, because turning point 2, you're going to spend that APL to capture that objective. But after that, you don't really need that APL there, so you want to move them off and be able to move and do other things. But you also really want to be stacking your ability to reach that middle objective, ideally after your opponent with more APL, or be able to have such a imposing presence on that objective that your opponent can't really deal with it. Because if you can wait out, let your opponent do all their moves, then if they leave someone on the objective, kill them, and then take the objective away from them, that's an optimum way to play secure. So a bit of a weird one. It's the base mission, and the timing is, I'd say, dependent upon what your opponent has, and therefore slightly more complex. You don't necessarily want to rush. And turning point 1, I would play a bit more cautious. I wouldn't be rushing out there straight away, because you don't necessarily need to deny your opponent those points immediately. Now, the other bit I want to talk about is this a good one for you to select for your primary op? So because of the fact that there's only really 9 VP on the board, I'm going to say that most of the time this probably isn't the best one for you to select. And the reason is that you want to be getting 5 VP minimum. So that means you have to go up on VP either of 2 of the 3 turning points as a minimum, and you want to be scoring 2 VP on each of those turning points, and then 1 VP on your last, or 2 VP throughout. Now that can be quite a tall order for you to be able to move your models out and take that on turning point 2. That might expose you to damage, which then might make it harder for you to potentially get that on turning point 3 or 4. So you need to think about how much durability you have on your team, and make sure, do you think that you can get out there, take it, and then take it again on the subsequent turning point, and even potentially the turning point afterwards. So if that is what you think you're going to do, then just be aware of that, and make sure you haven't overexposed yourself, because the last thing you want to do is do something where you go like 2 VP on turning point 2, but then only 1 VP on turning point 3, and then maybe 1 or even 0 VP on turning point 4. So something to be aware of. A lot of the way these games score, the last turning point, becomes really impactful for scoring. So just think about that as you go through. So that's mission 1. So let's talk about mission 2, loot. Again, if you're familiar with the old edition, you've almost certainly played quite a bit of this. Again, the main difference from the last edition, if you are coming straight to this from the last edition, is that you can't perform that action whilst within control range of a enemy operative. So I'll just go through the overview for those who are brand new to playing the edition, and you might want to just have a quick refresh of what the mission is itself. So mission 2, loot, it is a 1 AP mission action. 1 objective marker that active operative controls is looted. The caveats on this, so the restrictions, is an operative cannot perform this action during the first turning point. So you can't rush out during turning point 1 and try and loot a bunch of points. you have to wait until turning point 2, 3, and 4. That is consistent across all of these missions, but just to remind you, you can't perform this action whilst within control range of an enemy objective. As I said, you can't charge onto the point, be in close combat, and then loot from underneath your feet unless you have a special rule to be able to get around that. And also, you can't perform this on an objective marker that has already been looted during a turning point. So there is a benefit here to looting things early, because if you do so, then potentially you can get more VP than your opponent. The victory points itself is very, very simple. So whenever a friendly operative performs a loot action, you score 1 VP to a maximum of 2 VP a turning point. So the way that this works is it's going to benefit you if you're faster, i.e. if you can get out and get on those points before your opponent, you can get more VP than them each turning point. For the total VP that's available on the board, there is a maximum of 3 VP per turning point on turning point 2, 3, and 4. Therefore, a total of 9 VP available in the entirety of the game when it comes to this. So again, if you want to go for the primary op, and that's what you're trying to get for this, you need to potentially look at a score of 5 or 6. You're taking the lion's share of those points, and something for you to be aware of. One of the main points that I want to make on this is what isn't specified here. So you can perform the loot action as many times as you want. Well, 3 times essentially, but you can only score for 2 of them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't score, or you shouldn't perform the loot action more than that. So you can do a really mean thing here, where if potentially you have greater APL than your opponent, you can loot one of their objectives in their own half if they haven't looted it yet, and deny them that VP. So this is one of those ones where actually playing fast and playing aggressively in a high tempo game is probably going to help you out. Additionally, I think loot is one of those missions where you have to really consider how you wanted to play on turning point 1. So your opponent wants to ideally move up quite quickly on turning point 2 and take these points away from you. So I think at the end of turning point 1, you potentially, depending upon your opponent, but you might want to think about leaving some models contesting these objectives to deny your opponent just being able to take them right at the start of the turning point. Because if they're trying to go for the CritOp as their primary op, they really, really want to get that 2 VP. They really, really want to try and steal that central objective before you can reach it. And potentially just by having a model, a 2 APL model on there, it means they have to use a comms to get a 3 APL model on there, or they use a CP or something like that, and they're having to invest more on there. Or if you have an icon, maybe they can't even do it. Or, and that's the way that I would try and think about this is there a way for you to deny your opponent scoring points by using your models and your APL to make them have less efficient means of doing this? So that's the first point. So turning point 1, I might take a slightly more forward-leaning approach in this, particularly if I think my opponent is likely to try and take the CritOp as their primary op. Now, I'm not necessarily going to say that I think it is a good one to take as your primary op, because I would suggest this is actually a very high-risk mission to try and take as a primary op. The reason for that is, as I said, there's a maximum of 9 VP. You need to score 5 of them to be able to max out your primary op on this objective. And it's very easy for your opponent to potentially deny you that via a quick action on turning point 2 or 3 or 4 to just deny you being able to score the points that you wanted to. So, for instance, you might have ended turning point 2, you moved out nice and early, you've got some points, you've taken some damage, but you achieved your 2 VP, so you think you're in a good place. But now your opponent wins initiative, and they have an APL buff model that's within range of the central objective, and they just throw them out there and take it. And you go, okay, well, this isn't a problem. They've scored 2 VP, and now you're into the initiative roll for the last turning point. And if you lose it, there's a potential they can just move on to that objective, ignore killing you or something, and suddenly you're now only scoring, 3 points on your primary, which is only going to give you 2 points on your primary op, so 3 points tack up, 2 points to your primary op, and suddenly you missed out because of initiative rolls. So just be careful of that. And therefore, when it comes to this, because of tempo, it is a bit of a high tempo game. You are going to have to move models forwards earlier, i.e. probably during turning point 1 if you're trying to play this game plan. And I'd suggest you want to be a team that ideally has some sort of initiative manipulation. So do you have an ability to add on to your initiative rolls, re-roll your initiative rolls or something like this? Because if that's what you're reliant on to try and score this, then you have to make sure you stack those odds really in your favour. So just something to consider, like you want to make sure if you're going for loot that you're pacing the game correctly, because it can be quite a fast pace and it is high risk potentially to play it for your primary op. Now, there is teams where, or there are teams where that makes perfect sense, and therefore, you do you in this, right? But I'm just trying to tell you the risks that you become somewhat initiative based because of the way it's scored, and therefore it is a higher risk when it comes to these things. So generically, total VP, 9 VP on the board. The timing is scored during the turning point. The tempo is fast, and it's a high risk when it comes to the primary op selection. So that's my overview of mission 2 for loot. Alrighty, we're now into mission 3, transmission. So this mission has a mission action called Initiate Transmission. One objective marker that active operative controls is transmitting until the start of the next turning point. It's a 1 AP action. The restrictions: an operative cannot perform this action during the first turning point, no shocks there, or while within control range of any operative. As I said, that's to be expected. So let's see how this one scores then. So for victory points, at the end of each turning point after the first, no shocks. If friendly operatives control any transmitting objective markers, you score 1 VP. If friendly operatives control more transmitting objective markers than enemy operatives do, you score 1 VP. So key points here, initially just going into what's available. Total VP that are on the board is going to be 9 VP. You can score a maximum of 2 per turning point yourself, and your opponent can score 1 per turning point as well. So maximum 9 VP for the split. The other bit is, timing wise, this is scored at the end of the turning point. And finally, when it comes to tempo, because it's scored at the turning point, this is one way you can afford to sort of wait out. Now, this is done slightly differently because you don't actually need to be the one that does the mission action to score these points. So I would actually suggest that you don't want to be moving particularly fast onto the objectives at all if you can avoid it. You really want your opponent to be wasting their APL, making the objective transmit, and then you can focus your APL on doing damage to your opponent or moving on to the objective with more models later on. So actually, this is one of the slower based tempos in my opinion. You don't want to be wasting your APL early on, because if you're doing so, then you're potentially reducing your damage output, and that means more likely your opponents will be able to put models onto the objective and be able to do this themselves. So if possible, you want your opponent to be spending at least 2 APL at turning point starting these transmissions, and then you be scoring 2 VP as a result. And that would be the optimum way for you to maximize your score whilst also minimizing your opponent's APL efficiency going forwards. So just be aware of that. Like, if you're going to be spending APL, turn this objective on, make sure you're going to be scoring from it, because otherwise you're just doing your opponent a favor. And that might be like a key point when it comes to this game when you're playing, right? So in mission 3, really think about, do you have the ability to stay there and hang around, or is your opponent going to potentially just move on there after having killed your model, and you've just saved them the effort? Because if you're against a melee team in particular, is what I'm thinking, they don't want to have to be pushing these buttons, right? So if you go on and push the button, well, they can just charge you, kill you. They like doing that, they want to do that, and now they're going to score points at the same time because you've done the mission action for them. So just check to see what the threat ranges are, and are you basically giving your opponent a free APL buff and giving them a free mission action by doing this? Because if you are, then that's probably not worth doing, and you're actually better off either not tapping it or just moving your model away and letting them move on and expose their model and waste their APL instead. So just something for you to think about. When it comes to primary op though, I think it's actually probably one of the better ones, or a better one to try and go for. It's a bit balanced. Again, for the VP split, you're not guaranteed. It is going to be competitive between you and your opponent as to who's going to score what. But at least I think, because again, with it being into the turning point, you have a bit more control over it than, say, loot. I wouldn't rush into it as my primary op necessarily. I'm not saying it's like a go-to option at all. I'm just saying that, like, in comparison to loot, it's a little bit less risky because you can wait into the turning point and see how it's playing out. You can see what your opponent's doing and then invest just the right amount of APL to hopefully try and stop it. Additionally, you don't necessarily have to waste APL on your other side of the opponent's board to be able to take their objectives away from them. So if, for instance, your left flank has gone terribly wrong, but you have a model that can potentially, with 3 APL, move dash onto their objective and it's 3 APL, and they can contest it against your opponents, Well, you might be able to score a sneaky primary point that your opponent didn't see, or better yet, deny your opponent a primary point they weren't necessarily seeing. So because you don't have to get on there and waste that APL potentially to take that objective from them, you just have to just go in there and contest it essentially. So it's good for denying VPs, but also just be aware that it's easier for your opponent to deny VPs as well. So the more I've talked about it, the more I think maybe this isn't the best one for you to choose as a primary op. So just be aware of that, because your opponent can move models on and just take this away from you by potentially move blocking you rather than just having to spend any action points. So a good point for us to think about. So that's mission 3, transmission. Let's move on to the next one. Alrighty, so let's talk about mission 4, upload. So this is going to get a little bit more complicated because it'll take a few times to read this for it to hopefully make sense. So bear with me and hopefully make sense towards the end. All right, so let's talk through the mission action first, and then we'll talk through the victory points. So the mission action itself is called upload 1 AP mission action. So the first thing with this mission action is remove all of your opponent's upload points, if any, from the objective marker that active operative controls. So you're going to remove any of your opponent's points as soon as you spend this action. Then that objective marker gains 1 of your upload points, unless it already gained 1 of your upload points during this turning point. Or if you've already scored from that objective marker, use a dice as a token to keep track of your upload points on that objective marker. Again, standard restrictions for this: an operative cannot perform this action during the first turning point or whilst within control range of an enemy operative. So let's get into the explanation of victory points, and hopefully it makes a bit more sense as we go through. So at the end of each turning point after the first, the end of each turning point, you can score from any objective markers that have 1 or more of your upload points. For each that you do, remove all your upload points from it. You score the same number of VP, but you can only score from each objective marker once. And note that friendly operatives don't have to control that objective marker to score from it. So this is like a gamble, is the easiest way to describe it. You can spend a mission action each turning point to, after the first, so turning point 2, you can spend a mission action and you can get an upload point. You can then spend another mission action on turning point 3 to get an upload point. You can spend another mission action on turning point 4 to get an upload point. And then at the end of that turning point 4, you can say, cool, I'm going to take all 3 of those points and take them into my VP stash, and I get 3 points from it. The risk is, if, let's say, you've done that on turning point 1 and turning point 2, and you did it at the start of turning point 3, and then towards the end of turning point 3, your opponent manages to get someone onto your objective and do the mission action, they'll remove all of those points that you've worked so hard to try and achieve, and they'll then score 1 VP, and you'll score nothing. So it is a gamble, and what this is kind of like the way to think about this mission is how long can you hold out on a point, how often do you want to tap that point to be able to achieve VP before you then potentially lose it to your opponent being able to come on and take it away from you. So a really interesting dynamic to this one, and there's a few other tricks that I want to just talk about which are quite important. So I would say that this one is a mission that's going to penalise you rushing too fast. Okay, so just be aware of that, and I'll sort of explain why. So firstly, 9 VP total. Each one can potentially be scored like once per turning point and to a maximum of 9 VP. And even though you could theoretically score 9 VP on this as an individual, in the approved ops pack, you're limited to scoring a maximum of 6 VP for CritOps. Even if you go to every single one of these and put down multiple upload points and you score them all, you're only going to be getting 6. So don't waste your APL going beyond 6. But there's some really interesting points with this. So firstly, it's the first caveat of removing all of your opponent's upload tokens, if any. So there is a potential here for you to be really mean to your opponent's scoring, but also for your opponent to stop you from scoring that turning point. So if you were to go onto the objective marker and you spend your mission action during that turning point, and you add an upload token to your mission right at the start of the turning point, and your opponent then moves on and takes it away, well, there's no way for you to be able to add another upload point to that, but it has been lost. So my point being is that if you rush out really fast and you tap all 3 objectives at the start of turning point 2, well, during the turning point, if your opponent taps one back, you can't then go back on and tap it and then score. You'll just be denying your opponent scoring points, because the second caveat on this, that objective marker gains one of your upload points unless it already gained one of your upload points during this turning point. So you can't potentially score, spend a point, put an upload token on it. Your opponent then takes one away, removes your upload token. You can't go back and capture it, right? So my point is that you don't want to be too aggressive on this. So this is a slow tempo game, but with a caveat, right? Because it's a slow tempo game where you don't want to be rushing out and trying to score points where your opponent can deny them. But also, critically, after turning point 2, the tempo completely changes, because your opponent now has a much more vested interest in moving on to those objectives and denying them from you, right? So you want to be careful how you want to do this. So you kind of want to get these on at the end of the turning point, and then make an assessment of how likely you are to be able to keep that objective during the next turning point, right? So, and you have to make that decision at the end of the turning point, not during, not after you've seen initiative rolls, right? So you are going to have to do some gambles here, right? Where you think to yourself, okay, so maybe turning point 2, you've moved up, you've put an upload point on both your home objective and the central objective, and your opponent's put one of their upload points on their home objective. Now you have a decision to make. Like, do you just score that VP in the middle right there? And if you do, you're probably going to be limiting yourself to 4, maybe 5 VP if you can get one of your opponent's VPs, but probably 4 VP, because you can get through on your home objective, but you're going to really struggle to get more than that on the central objective. So you just need to think about, like, is it worth it, or do you think that you can tap it again and hold it for the whole of the next turning point? And that's the key part, right? Can you hold it for the whole of the next turning point to be able to score it at the end of that and get 2 VP? Because if you can't, well, again, it's probably wasted. So it's like a very weird tempo, right? Where it's like turning point 2, you want to be moving on towards right at the end, and then you want to be like on it and defending it as long as you can possibly hold on for going forwards. Now, a few tactics that people sort of will talk about, probably, I imagine, in the forums, the discords and that sort of stuff. If you get on the Patreon Discord, you probably hear people like Average Joe talking about already, is things like denied flanks, right? So quite often you might want to just go, let's say you're playing ITD, and you have the 3 objectives, 3 routes, and you want to decide, how am I going to maximize my score on this objective? And you might want to see how your opponent's deploying. So let's say that they've weighted quite a few of their models towards their home objective, and you think to yourself, well, they're probably, home objective closer to them, they're probably going to score that anyway. I think they're going to be able to reach it, and they're probably going to be able to get that, and they're probably going to score quite well. So what I'll do is I'll just give them that flank. I'll deny that flank. I'll just say, yep, you can have it. You can, put as many models into that room as you possibly want. And I'm going to focus all of my models potentially towards the central objective. And I'm going to make sure that I score more points in the central objective, or even the home objective where it's going to be. And maybe that's the route that you're going to try and take it, to be able to go, right, this is how I'm going to score points. Or potentially, maybe your opponent has not committed very many models to their home objective, because they're going to try and go heavy on the central objective. Well, you could look at that and think to yourself, well, if I put quite a lot of models into trying to reach their home objective, maybe I can spook them and make them upload their points early and limit the amount of points that they can score. Or, I can even better, I can get onto their objective at turning point 3 and spend a mission action, and suddenly you've denied them 3 VP and you've gone up in VP. So there's a little bit of thought process here about, like, where do you weight your effort? Do you put it on one flank or the other necessarily? And where do you want to try and score those VPs? And the main part that I would say with the tempo of this mission, again, is just that it's not going to be particularly fast, right? So it's turning point 1, you probably want to be setting up, not on objectives, but able to reach objectives during turning point 2. You then want to make sure you get to turning point 2 towards the end, most likely, and establish yourself so that you can then hold it for longer than that. Is probably the way that you'd want to go. Now, additionally, your opponent can just try and go with, I'm going to try and score a couple of VP on each of these, and then I'm just going to ignore the prime objective and just focus on trying to deny you yours. And that could be a bit of a risk for you, so something to be aware of. When it comes to choosing this as a primary op, I'd say it's quite risky, because a lot of it is going to come down to gambling. So you're essentially trying to hold out on your primary objective. You want, ideally, if you're going to max this, you're probably wanting to get like 3 VP off your home objective, and then 2 VP on the central objective, and then maybe 1 VP on your opponent's home objective, but that does seem unlikely. So maybe like a 3-2 split. So you've got a very fine margin there where your opponent could potentially spend an action point, reset you down to 0 on the central objective or your home objective, and suddenly you're going to be scoring very, very little on your primary op. So primary op for this one is pretty high risk, I'd suggest, but a very interesting way of the game playing. So quite a confusing one. You might have to read that once or twice when you first read it to make sure it makes sense. But it's kind of like how many points can you stack on an objective before then claiming it at the end of a turning point, and really how much risk do you want to take where your opponent could potentially reach your home objectives. A key bit of advice that I think people should make sure they're aware of: turning point 4, like if you have been, or going end of turning point 3 into turning point 4, if you have been banking on getting a 3 VP score on your home objective, make sure that your opponent is not going to be able to take it during that turning point. And have a look really at those threat ranges, because if you've left like one person with 2 APL just on that back objective, and at the start of turning point 4 there is someone that's a move dash away with 3 APL, you can bet your bottom dollar they are going to take that objective from you as their first action, because it's going to deny you 2 VP straight away. In fact, it's going to deny you 3 VP really, and that might be game right there and then as a single move. So just be really aware of that, because if there is someone that you think, you know what, if I don't win initiative, I'm going to lose these 2 VP, that might be where you call it and say, yep, well, instead of doing that, I'm going to bank the 2 and accept that I'm not getting the 3rd one, and focus now on denying my opponent the 3rd VP somewhere else. So something to be aware of. And if you're playing the reverse, something to consider, you might want to set up a little sneaky play at the end of turning point 3, so you're a move dash away with a 3 APL model to be able to take that point and deny that your opponent all those VPs in a quite mean way. Okay. Mission 5, Intel. This is a really interesting, cool mission because potentially it's really low scoring. It has a maximum of 9 VP, but also a minimum of like 3 VP in a sense. And I'll explain that as I explain how the mission works, but hopefully it makes sense to you as I go through it. So let's first start with the mission action. So compile intel for 1 AP. One objective marker that active operative controls gains 1 intel point. Use a dice as a token to keep track of the intel points on that objective marker, right? So it's basically each time you spend this action, you're going to add to that dice to a maximum of 3 on that dice, okay? An operative cannot perform this action during the first turning point while within control range of any operative, or if that objective marker has already gained an intel point during this turning point. Quite simple, you can't just spam 3 actions in a row and get 3 VP or 3 intel points on objective, so you're only going to be able to gain an intel point per turning point, to a maximum of 3. Note as well that this isn't split between you and your opponent, so those markers are generic, so therefore if you're spending these action points, there's a chance you're going to be giving your opponents points as well later on if they take this away from you. Additional rules, okay, so this has additional rule that needs to be thought about. So in each turning point after the first, the pickup marker action can be performed upon each objective marker that has at least 1 intel point. If it is performed, that marker cannot gain any more intel points. So this is really interesting, right? Because what this means is if you know that your opponent potentially is trying to go for their primary op as their CritOp, right? This is why it's a high risk one for this. You could potentially, turning point 2, artificially reduce the total VP that is in the game, and therefore deny your opponent the ability to max their CritOp, right? So for instance, the way this could work, you could move on to the central objective, turning point 2, with a 3 APL model. You can add an intel point, then you can pick up that marker, and now that marker is worth 1 VP at the end of the game, and you reduce the maximum threshold of VP available from 9 VP down to 7 VP in the game, right? So just be aware of. I'll explain how the VP works now, and then hopefully we'll talk about tactics, and it'll make a bit more sense. So At the end of the 4th turning point, so this is scored all at the end of the game, right? So not during the turning point, it's scored all at the end of the game. So at the end of the 4th turning point, for each objective marker friendly operatives control, you score a number of VP equal to its intel points. So again, theoretically, if everyone was to spend a mission action each turning point, and they make them all up to 3 intel points each, then theoretically there's 9 VP available on the board. But as I said, you can also artificially reduce that. So you could potentially, if you wanted to, deny that middle objective straight away if you're not particularly fussed on trying to achieve it, and then focus on just doing your home objective and spending those points to get that to 3 VP, and then you could score 4 VP potentially. And the main point would be is that you would be denying your opponent being able to get above 3 VP. And that's actually pretty mean. So this is like a really interesting mission, because you can directly control the total available like pool of VP for primary very, very easily. And therefore it's quite a risk, right? So if you know for whatever reason, if you had an ability to find out, or your opponent's made it obvious for some reason that they're trying to go for the CritOp as their primary op, or you think they've got really bad tac ops and you have a very durable team, well, you could just go, all right, well, I'm going to make the primary op score less, and I'm going to force that to be really, really close. So the CritOp is worth significantly less than normal, because I know that I'm going to max my tac ops and I'm going to probably do quite well on the kill op. And now I'm going to force you to play a different game than you want to play. And then they have to go quite aggressive to try and take your home objective away from you, which probably means that they're going to be out of position. They'll be moving, more aggressively towards you, because they have to try and do that. And suddenly you might be able to get some more kills and that sort of stuff. So a really interesting way of playing this. So the tempo for this is completely dependent upon what your opponent wants to achieve, which is kind of a weird one, right? So because your opponent could have that mentality of, I'm going to just deny you VP and you're going to have to chase me, if you know that's something that they're going to do, and you're trying to use this as your CritOp for whatever reason, then you need to make sure that you're controlling that objective at the end of turning point 1 to stop them from being able to do that, right? So something to be aware of. Additionally, they might be trying to do the same thing. So turning point 1 positioning, this might be one of those ones where actually, if you're trying to max on CritOps, if you think that's your win path is best in the CritOp avenue, then you really want to make sure that you have control of these objectives, and you want to be stacking those points on them. And ideally, I would suggest you want to stack turning point 2 and turning point 3, and probably running away with it in turning point 3, because if you can get it away and score 5 points, you're going to max your primary up, right? So you get your 3, and you get a respectable score of 8, which is pretty good. And you're going to be making your opponent score a maximum of effectively 3 points on the CritOp. And that's a good points differential to be able to achieve, to be able to make sure you have a good chance of success, right? Depending upon how many models you've lost and that sort of thing. But something to be aware of. Now, if you think that you can potentially sit there and just tap this objective the whole time, and hold it, then you can maybe go for 6. But just be aware that if they kill you off of it and run away with it, or contest it at the end, because everything is scored in the last turning point, all those VPs you're leaving down to that very last moment, that's quite high risk, because if you overextend yourself and you expose yourself in the wrong way, potentially you could be getting 0. And sure, they could get 9. Remember, it's limited at 6, but they could potentially be denying those points for you. So a really interesting mission 5. So that's intel. So hopefully that's been of some use. So mission 6, extraction. So this mission has a mission action called search. One objective marker that active operative controls is searched. If it is the last objective marker to be searched, the marker becomes the extraction objective marker. The caveats or restrictions that are applied to this mission action: you cannot perform this action during a first turning point whilst in control range of an enemy operative, or if that objective marker has already been searched. Kind of makes sense. And there is some additional rules that need to be read with this. All right, so the additional rule then: the pickup marker action can be performed upon the extraction objective marker. So remember, that's the last one. So you're going to search. The last one becomes the extraction one. You can pick up that marker, none of the others. While an operative is carrying that marker, worsen the hit stat of its weapons by 1. It cannot be removed and set up again more than 6 inches away, and it cannot perform charge or dash actions. So you're going to be slowed down. You can't use the fly ability like Vespid's fly or something like that. and you can't dash. So you'll be hitting worse, moving slower, and that sort of thing. So where you might see people do this is you dash to within 1 inch of the objective marker, pick it up, and then you can do your normal move. But you wouldn't be able to do a normal move up to the objective marker, collect it, and then dash away, right? So something to be considering there. When it comes to VP though, there's 2 different ways to score, so I'll talk those through now. So whenever a friendly operative performs the search action, you score 1 VP. If it is the first or third objective marker to be searched. If it is the second objective marker to be searched, you score 2 VP. So bit of a weird way to think about this. When you go onto an objective marker for the first time and you spend that mission action, you're going to score a VP, right? Then if your opponent goes and searches the other one, they're going to score 2 VP, and then you're going to be able to move up, search the final one, and score 3 VP. And the reason they've done that, and the reason for the balancing, in my opinion, is because you then get the advantage of determining where the extraction marker is going to be. So let's say you decide to rush up and claim your home objective and the central objective, and now your opponent thinks to themselves, well, if I claim this objective, I get the advantage that the extraction marker is in my home territory, so they can potentially wait it out. So there's a few interesting things here where selection of like where's best to choose, like what to extract and what not to extract is going to be quite interesting. So for tempo, I think if you can, you kind of want to force your opponent into making a somewhat bad decision. So for instance, turning point 2, nothing's been searched, you're good to go, right? If you move and search the central objective, you score a VP. Now your opponent has to make a choice because they can search their home objective and they will get 2 VP. But if they do that, then the extraction marker is then going to be in your home territory, and you'll score a VP when you search it and reveal it. Now, the second part of the scoring is going to come down to where this extraction marker is, right? So at the end of each turning point after the first, so you're scoring this at the end of each turning point, if a friendly operative controls the extraction objective marker, you score 1 VP, or 2 VP if it is the 4th turning point. So this is where the tempo is really interesting in this one, because it's completely different to the other missions. So firstly, you're scoring as you do the actions, right? So there's a scoring system where you can score potentially up to 4 VP, but realistically you're going to be scoring 2 by doing the actions that are associated with the marker. Then there is a secondary scoring system which happens at the end of each turning point, right? So and it gets a even bigger score on the final turning point. So this is where my strategy comes in, because there's going to be a bit of a rush, I think, to try and search that central objective. Because if you search a central objective, that makes your opponent have a really tough decision, right? Because now they have to choose, and the choice is, do I give you the token that's going to score at the end of each turn and score more points, potentially, and let you have it in your half quite far away, or do I wait, let you score 3 points on the primary, and then have that advantage myself potentially later on? So it's a little bit of like, chicken egg here. It's like, who wants to go first? Who wants to take that point? Who doesn't? And I think probably you want to have a sort of like a rush for the center, because that's going to give you like a little swing point, and then everyone can try and decide what they want to do. The other option is, of course, you both can just claim your home objectives at the start of turning point 2, and then you have a very balanced game where the objective you want to control is right in the middle, and now you're sort of playing it as like a cool, that's what we want to try and get to, and it's kind of like stagnant. But that's kind of like up to you. So if your opponent taps their home objective, you can guarantee that you can get a lot more VP by doing that, right? So I personally think it'll be a mistake for you to tap your home objective straight away, because the way that I'd see it happening is at the start of turning point 2, if you spend your first action tapping your home objective, then your opponent is going to move into the center objective, they're going to tap that center objective, and they're going to score 2 VP. And you're not going to be able to reach their home objective, so they're going to tap their home objective, that's going to score another VP for 3 VP, and then they're going to have that extraction marker in their half, which they can control to score a 4th VP. So in a single turning point, you're essentially scoring potentially 4 VP, and they're going to score it again subsequently. So on timing, tapping your home objective in extraction, be very, very careful if you do that, because if you're not able to deny them taking the middle objective away from you, you've probably just given them a massive point swing in primary. Just something to be aware of. So a very interesting mission, plays very, very differently. I think the way that I would play it is you want to be setting up for that middle objective and waiting to see what your opponent does, right? So if you can get there first and take it, then your opponent has to make that hard choice. Maybe they go for the guaranteed 2 VP there and then, but they're probably giving you 3 VP that turn is the way that I would look at it. So that's a really interesting point. And maybe they go, cool, I'll do that. Or they let you get the 3 VP and then they can take the 2 VP that turning point. So a really interesting point or a way to think about that. When it comes to primary op selection, again, this is it's going to depend on what sort of team you have, so and what your mobility potential is. So if you have the ability to reach their back line quite easily, you're quite a mobile team. I think actually this is probably quite a good one, because you can probably guarantee that you're going to get to the central objective before them. You're going to be able to take that. You're probably going to be able to guarantee that you get the 3 VP from that turning point, whatever happens, right? Because you tap the center one, you can tap the second one, you've got 3 VP, you've already achieved half your win condition, and then all you really need to do is control the objective at the end of the game. So you've got a whole sort of 2 turning points to now get over there and control it, and you're going to get 5, which will then max your primary op. So if you're a mobile team, I think it kind of makes sense. But if you're a slow team, maybe not the one for you to take. But a few things to think about there when it comes to extraction. Okay, let's talk about mission 7, Sabotage. So the mission action for this one is, again, 1 AP. If an active operative controls the objective marker wholly within your opponent's territory, that objective marker is sabotaged. An operative cannot perform this action during the first turning point. I mean, good luck getting there in the first place, but if you could, you can't. While within control range of an enemy operative, or if that objective marker has already been sabotaged this turning point. So nice and simple. So the key point is you can only sabotage the objective marker that's in your opponent's half, right? You can't sabotage your own objectives, and you can't sabotage the one on the center line. It has to be the one that your opponent is protecting in their own half, right? So the one at the back is the way to think about it. Victory points though, let's talk through this. So whenever a friendly operative performs a sabotage action, you score a VP. That's the one I just talked about. If you go up to your opponent's objective, you control it, and you spend an AP and you blow it up, you're going to get a VP. Nice and simple. That's going to be scored obviously during the turning point. Then the second way you can score a VP, at the end of each turning point after the first, you score 1 VP for each of the following friendly operatives control. The objective marker wholly within your opponent's territory, unless it's been sabotaged at its turning point. The objective marker wholly within your territory, unless it's been sabotaged at its turning point, and the objective marker on the center line, right? So those are the 2 or 3 ways that you can score. However, you can only ever score a maximum of 2 VP per turning point. So the way to think about this is if you go and sabotage your opponent's objective marker, and you hold your objective marker and the center objective marker, you still only score 2 VP, but you'll deny your opponent scoring their home objective marker for VP because it's been sabotaged. So that's kind of the way it works, right? So you want to, this is kind of like a protect your home base, play for the middle, and see if you can deny your opponent a VP by blowing up their base, all right? So if you do that, you're going to be getting 2 VP and making them score little. So maximum that you could score on this isn't maximum available VP is 9 VP, so you can score 2 VP per turning point. Your opponent can score 1 VP at turning point. But there's a few different ways that you can essentially achieve your VP. So if you know that you're not necessarily going to be able to hold the center anymore, but you can go and sabotage your opponent's objective, well, that's going to get you your 2 VP. Additionally, if you've had your objective sabotaged, well, it's time to get across the board, hold the center, and go and sabotage your opponents, because that can still get you 2 VP, all right? So there is a way for you to potentially both be scoring VP by sabotaging each of the objectives, and then it becomes like a fight for the center. So it's kind of an interesting way of viewing it. So key points. 1, you can score during the turning point. Not everything is scored at the end of the turning point, but the majority of points are scored at the end of the turning point. So there is a benefit to rushing and getting some points during the turning point. But most of the time, I think that's going to feel more like denying your opponent points than it is going to be scoring points yourself. You're kind of just shifting where you're scoring those points. I think, if you're able to reach your opponent's home objective and blow it up, you're probably able to reach the center objective if you wanted to. So just be careful you're not like both blowing up each other's objectives and your opponent is just holding the center and you've misplayed, or you've moved models away when potentially just holding the center would be more beneficial to you for how much VP you could score. But you also want to make sure that your home objective isn't being taken away from you. So a few ways to do that, again, is things like icons and that sort of stuff, making sure that your opponent can't spend that mission action. If you have ways to make mission actions cost more points, doing that on your home objective might be a really effective way to stop them from being able to actually make the movement they need to reach your objective and then blow it up. Using things like tripwire and that sort of stuff, keeping people away, is going to be a really important thing in this one to protect your home objective, right? So you really want to make sure your home objective isn't too exposed during this game mode. For timing and tempo wise, I think, again, because this is my personal opinion, because it's scored towards, like, the majority of the scoring towards the end of the turning point, I would play this majority of the time slowly, and I'd probably on turning point 4 make a rush to blow up your opponent's objective at sort of like the beginning of turning point 4, or to be fair, you do it at the end of turning point 4 as well. So no, in fact, yeah, I think generically you probably want to play this one quite slowly, because if you can do that sabotage action towards the end, then you're much better off, right? So you don't necessarily need to do it straight away, and by doing so, you're gaining a VP, but you're critically denying your opponent a VP. So it could be a 2-point swing, but it might also only be a 1-point swing if you already own the center and you own your home. So this is probably like a slow played objective, and I'd be looking probably during turning point 1 to be holding back, making sure you defended your home objective appropriately, so your opponents aren't going to get on there and sabotage that straight away. But I'd be looking mainly to bias my forces towards that central point, because that's where you're going to be scoring a second VP, particularly if you're going for this for your primary op. That's where you're going to be scoring your second point. You're unlikely to make it all the way to your opponent's home line and take their objective from them if they're defending it properly, right? So probably slow playing a little bit, not slow playing as in like a slow tempo of play. Don't never slow play your opponent. That's no fun for anyone. But a slower tempo of the game. So you want to make sure that you maximize your damage and your threat saturation so that your opponent doesn't move onto that central objective, or if they do, you can punish them and then take it away from them at the end. So that's probably the way in which I would think about it. The other thing as well that's worth noting is the APL efficiency for this. I've not talked about this in enough detail in some of these, but because it's only 1 AP on your opponent's objective, this is actually very APL light when it comes to the mission scoring, right? So you don't need to spend APL on your home objective. You don't need to spend APL on the central objective. It's only if you're denying your opponent VP or trying to do a sabotage action. So this is one of the lightest mission actions for points. So just be aware of that. You can score 6 VP by not spending any action points. So just by sitting on objectives and doing a thing, you can maximize your CritOp. So something to be aware of there. All right. So we're into mission 8. We're almost at the end. Mission 8 then, Power Surge. So the mission action for Power Surge is reroute power. One surge objective marker, the active operative controls, is rerouted. An operative cannot perform this action during the first turning point while within control range of any operative, or if that objective marker has already been rerouted. So you're probably thinking, what is a surged objective marker? Because that makes no sense. Well, luckily, there's an additional rule which you can explain just how that works. So as a strategic gambit, so like a strategic ploy, in each turning point after the first, one player selects one objective marker to be surged. Until the start of the next turning point, they cannot select one previously surged. The next player who doesn't have initiative selects first. So the player who doesn't have initiative selects first, then the players alternate each turning point thereafter. All right, so again, so you're going to roll off, you're going to see who has initiative, and then the player who doesn't have initiative is going to get to choose which objective marker is going to be surged, noting that that objective marker cannot then be surged the next turning point. All right, so interesting way to think about this. So you could potentially choose a central objective, but then your opponent's probably going to choose their home objective on the next one, and then you're going to choose yours. Or you could choose your objective, then your opponent could then choose their objective, and then turning point 4, you can go for the central objective. So the way that I would look at this is kind of like if if you're going second and you have initiative, you get to kind of choose the pace of the game. So if you go for, all right, I want to make it the central objective, turning point 2, I'm going to go for the central objective, you're going to escalate the pace of the game, right? So by doing so, your opponent has to play for that central objective, and they're probably going to play more aggressively, and you're also probably going to play more aggressively over that central point. Because turning point 3, they're probably almost certainly going to choose their home objective, and turning point 4, you're probably going to choose your home objective. So it works like a turning point 2 becomes really important. You have to rush forward and do something. Then you're both kind of like pulling back a little bit to try and hold your own grounds. So that's kind of like the way that I would see it. So the tempo is going to be determined by the second player, the player who doesn't have initiative in turning point 2. That kind of makes sense. Let's talk about victory points, because then we can see how this scores. So whenever a friendly operative performs the reroute power action, you score 1 VP. So this is a way for you to score VP during the turning point. So again, remember that's going to be the one that you choose. So it could be the central objective, could be the home objective, could be the other one that looks like the board. And at the end of each turning point after the first, if friendly operatives control the surge objective marker, you score 1 VP. If friendly operatives control more objective markers than enemy operatives do, score 1 VP. You can score a maximum of 2 VP per turning point from this CritOp. So lots of different ways to score. One, by spending a mission action, so that's during the turning point. The second one is going to be able to score by essentially controlling the selective objective that you want to go after. And then finally, it's controlling more objective markers than your opponent. So it's like an interesting way to make to think about this. Is like, okay, right, so you've got different ways to score, and you really want to make sure that you can control more objective markers than your opponent most of the time. But if you can't do that, then just controlling the right objective marker at the right time is good enough, if that makes sense. So, for instance, if you can, let's say you don't get initiative on turning point 2, right? And you choose the central objective. So you're going to play a rush game, you want to go into the middle. If you can get on that objective, noting that your opponent might be able to deny you, then you can potentially do it. But let's say that they're smart and they go, you know what, I think you're going to try and jump on that objective marker and boop it straight away. So I'm going to move on there and boop it before you do. They score a point. So now you're in like I really need to control this objective at the end of the turning point, or I need to control more than my opponent. So you can then move on, try and hold that objective till the end of the turning point. You have to play a bit of a longer game, or you're going to rush. If they don't do that, you have to rush on there and try and get the point straight away. So you see what I mean? Like it's a very interesting way that the tempo is going to be changed based on what your opponent's doing. So when you go to choose which objective you want to do, I would say look at where your opponent's models are right now and look how they've been buffed. Like, do they have sufficient APL to be able to race straight into that central objective and take it? Have you pre-positioned a model onto that central objective that's denying them from doing that? And therefore, can you just go, yep, it's going to be a central objective, and I know that I'm going to be able to get that, or you're going to have to move your model on to deny me. I'm probably going to get a kill, and then I'm going to pop it anyway. So if you're like an elite player, turning point 1, moving someone to the central objective, it's probably quite a strong little play, because now it's going to be like, well, if I give him that objective to be the one, they're just going to, take that, and I'm going to be forced into, scoring elsewhere. Or, I'm going to have to try and do this in a different way. Now, the other way you could look at this as well is you could also potentially try and play the long game with this. So you could say, all right, well, if I make it your objective in your baseline, you're definitely going to get 2 VP, right? You're definitely going to get 2 VP turning point 2. But if they've put quite a lot of models forwards and you think you can do quite a lot of damage, well, there's a potential there. You go, all right, well, I'm going to now punish your models that you've exposed. You've left 2 models in the middle. I'm going to do some real damage to you. And I know now that you're almost guaranteed, right? Like, you'd be crazy to give it back to my baseline objective, but maybe you do. But either way, I now know that it's going to be in the center of mine next, and therefore I don't have to worry about trying to get across the board. So there's different ways to think about it, but it's just kind of like I guess I don't have a direct answer for you as to what's going to be best to play well on that one, because it's always going to depend on what your opponent's doing. But my gut reaction is probably going to be, most of the time you want to be selecting the center objective, so that you can then have a chance of scoring it, or go for the safe net, boom, take the home objective. That probably means that your opponent's going to take their home objective the next turn, and then you need to be waiting around for turning point 4 to have that sort of fight off for the middle, which will become really important. So a very interesting mission, very different mission. Be interesting to see how it goes. Okay, finally, we're at mission 9, coordinates. And I believe this is the mission with the highest amount of possible VP. So let's go through some of the details. Mission action, input coordinates 1 AP, 1 objective marker. The active operative controls gains 1 of your objective points. Use dice to tokens, keep track of your objective points on that objective marker, right? Caveats, pretty standard. An operative cannot perform its action in the first turning point whilst you're in your control range of any operative, or if the objective marker has already gained 1 of your objective points during the turning point. And then, at the end of the 4th turning point, so you're not scoring anything during the game, everything in this is scored at the very, very end, right? So, at the end of the 4th turning point, for each objective marker that has at least 1 of your objective points, you score 1 VP, or 2 VP if that's in your opponent's territory. So, right there and then, you can score, essentially, 4 VP each if you've done a mission action on both. So 8 VP as an option between as a total between you. There's a second way you can score VP though. For each objective marker that has more than 1 of your objective points than your opponent's, you score 1 VP. So if you have more points than your opponent, you can score a VP. So interestingly, this basically means that you can both score 4, and then there's another 3 that you could potentially score on top of that, right? So this is actually, I'd say, one of the sort of highest, well, it is the highest scoring or highest potential both scoring when it comes to CritOp. So it's actually one of the better ones when it comes to trying to choose a primary op, because it's less competitive between the two of you. And this is why, right? So you can quite easily protect, say, your home objective, right? And make sure that you have 3 points on that, which are going to get you a VP. And then you can make sure that you get a point on the centre objective and a single point on their home objective. So you get 2 points for the home objective, you get a point for the centre objective, and then you would get 2 points for your home objective because you have more points than your opponent, and boom, you've got 5 VP. And your opponent can do exactly the same, and you're both going to be able to max. So really nice and easy. Like, I think it's probably one of the easiest ones for you to be able to get the highest amount of points on. So for primary op, probably quite a good choice, because you could both potentially max your primary ops and you're not going to be too worried. So something to be interested to be aware of when you're talking about these missions is, like, if your opponent is competing with you and there's a maximum amount of VP that you're having to share, well, it's going to become harder to max those primary ops. But for this one in particular, mission 9, it's probably going to be a higher scoring game on average, right? So something to be aware of, particularly also for tournament organisers. I reckon mission 9 is going to be a higher average scoring mission, which is interesting. Tempo wise, so because it's all scored at the end of the game, you don't need to worry about during the turning point when these things happen. So I would again favour playing this slowly and thinking more about how you can use your APL to stop your opponent doing the mission actions where they need to do it. Because if they can do their mission action at any point during the turning point, if they do it right at the start, they do it right at the end, it doesn't matter. They're still going to get the VP as a result. And they particularly want to go and jump onto your home objective. You're guaranteed some VP in this game mode just by basically tapping your home objective straight away. And you really want to try and get to your opponent's home objective, even if you just tap it once. Now, if you can tap more than that, and you can get more than your opponent, that's awesome. But to be honest, just making sure you tap your home objective 3 times, tapping the centre objective once or twice, and tapping your opponent's objective once, is probably good enough, right? So that's kind of the way in which that I would view it. So just something to be aware of. It's a different game. It's a higher scoring one, and probably one of the best ones for your primary ops. Alrighty, that brings us to the end of the CritOp analysis and guide, and hopefully there's some useful stuff in there as to what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the primary mission and how potentially you could use it to score some more VP. Now, on Patreon, we are going to be going over a bit more of these things. We're going to be talking about some TAC ops next. We're going to be talking about the kill op and potentially how you can min-max your teams on that. And I want to try and get into some team reviews later on. But we're going to focus on this sort of competitive guide as we can, and try and give those guys a bit more support, as well, hopefully as much support as they've been giving me in the channel, because it really is appreciated. So hopefully you've found something useful whilst in there. If you think I've got something wrong and potentially I've misread one of these things, then drop me a comment below and let us know where we've potentially got it wrong. Or if you think you've got a better strategy and you want to share it with the community, then absolutely let us know down below. There's potentially some really cool tricks and combos that teams can do to be able to get around some of the weaknesses that are in this, or some of the strengths that you can potentially play into when it comes to these missions. And we want to hear about them, right? We want to try and figure out how to optimize our games and make sure that we can be playing at the highest level. So if you found out something and you think there's something that you want to share with the community, let us know in the comments. It'd be awesome to be able to hear your opinion. But until then, I'll see you all next time.
That brings us to the end of the episode. Hopefully you found something new or useful while listening, and if you did, throwing us a like would be greatly appreciated. If you want to make sure you don't miss any episodes, make sure you hit that subscribe button and click on the bell so you get notifications as soon as the next one drops. It really is the best way to help a small channel like ours. And if you can't wait and you do want early access, we have a Patreon where you can get exclusive access to all our content ahead of time. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Just drop a comment below and we'll get right to you. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host Ryan, this has been Turning Point Tactics, and we'll see you next week.